Dulos, Petros Dulos, Constantine Dulos, Christiane Dulos, C. Noel Dulos, and Theodore Dulos are contributors to this profile. Assuming 3 contributors, Fotis Dulos, Petros Dulos, Constantine Dulos, Christiane Dulos, C. Noel Dulos, and Theodore Dulos are eliminated as contributors to the DNA profile from 134S1. Assuming 3 contributors, given the low likelihood ratios calculated, the results are inconclusive as to whether Michelle Troconis or Lauren Almeida could be contributors to the DNA profile from item 134S1. Paolo Gumini is eliminated as a contributor to the DNA profile from item 134S1.
State Police Exhibit 371, which is identified as 4 swabs from the area with blood lice staining on the steering wheel, subsequently submitted to the Division of Scientific Services and designated as submission 135. What were the results of that analysis?
The results are consistent with the DNA profile from item 135S1 being a mixture of 2 contributors. The results do not support the hypothesis that the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush, Michelle Troconis, or Lauren Almeida are contributors to this profile. Assuming 2 contributors, the sources of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush, Michelle Troconis, and Lauren Almeida are eliminated as contributors to the DNA profile from item 135S1. Fotis Dulos, Petros Dulos, Constantine Dulos, Christine Dulos, C. Noel Dulos, Theodore Dulos, and Pavel Gumeni are eliminated as contributors to the DNA profile from item 135S1.
State Police Exhibit 372, which was identified as 4 swabs from the interior side of the left front door, was submitted to the Division of Scientific Services as submission 136. And just with respect to these results, the results were consistent with a single individual, but every known profile along with the profile obtained from the toothbrush were eliminated. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
State Police Exhibit 373, which was identified as 2 swabs from the left front seat adjustment controls, was subsequently submitted to the Division of Scientific Services and designated as submission 137. Can you please indicate to the jury what the results were there?
The results are consistent with the DNA profile from item 137S1 being a mixture of 2 contributors. Assuming 2 contributors, the DNA profile from item 137S1 is at least 1.3 billion times more likely to occur if it originated from the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush and 1 unknown individual than if it originated from 2 unknown individuals. Assuming 2 contributors, given the low likelihood ratios calculated, the results are inconclusive whether Petros Dulos, Constantine Dulos, Christiane Dulos, C. Noel Dulos, or Theodore Dulos could be contributors to the DNA profile from 137S1. Fotis Dulos, Michelle Troconis, Lauren Almeida, and Pavel Gumeni are eliminated as contributors to the DNA profile from item 137S1.
State Police Exhibit 374, which was identified as 2 swabs from their rear view mirror, was subsequently submitted to the Division of Scientific Services and designated as submission 138. What were the results of that submission?
The results are consistent with the DNA profile from item 138S1 originating from a single individual. Assuming 1 individual, given the low likelihood ratios calculated, the results are inconclusive as to whether the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush.
Your Honor, the interpreter is going to ask, can we just slow down?
The results are inconclusive as to whether the source of the DNA profile from the swabbing of the electric toothbrush could be the source of the DNA profile from item 138S1.
And everyone else was eliminated, is that correct?
Yes.
And State Police Exhibit 375, which was identified as 2 swabs from the cargo area, rear seat controls, and subsequently submitted to the Division of Scientific Services and designated as submission 139. No profile was obtained, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about circumstances that can influence the presence or lack thereof of DNA. Could clothing or gloves or other objects in between a person and a surface impact the amount of DNA that is ultimately left on the surface?
If you're talking about from your hands,
So for example, if somebody's wearing gloves, could that impact whether or not they leave DNA on a particular surface?
if they're touching something with gloves, correct. The gloves would interfere with leaving the touch cells from your hands.
And in terms of whether or not, let's just say hypothetically, blood or a blood-like substance is left on an object and that item is subsequently swiped with either a cloth or a paper towel, could that also influence the amount of DNA that's left behind?
Yes.
How so?
Well, if you use something to wipe up something and then throw it away, you're cleaning up some of that liquid or whatever it is, blood. So then you're losing some of that DNA that was there and just leaving behind remnants of it.
And does DNA degrade under certain conditions as well?
It does.
What does it mean when DNA degrades?
The DNA is breaking up and you're getting less of it. So if it's under the influence of ultraviolet light, bleach, moisture, heat, all different factors can degrade DNA over time.
If I could just have a moment, Your Honor? I have nothing additional, Judge.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Ms. Madel.
Good afternoon.
So I'm looking at your resume, which has been put into evidence. You have a degree in biology, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you some questions about, for those of us who didn't major in biology, okay? So when we're talking about DNA, we're talking about something that is transmitted. Everybody has DNA, correct? We all, every living thing has DNA,
Yes.
whether it's a plant, a bug, an animal, or a human, right?
Yes.
At least when it comes to human beings, there are two sets of DNA that we inherit from our parents, correct?
Correct. Half from your mom and half from your dad.
So if we go back to basic biology, you have a mom and you have a dad, they have a child, and they inherit the DNA half from the father and half from the mother, right?
Correct.
And unless there's artificial insemination, you need two separate parents for that process to take place, right?
Correct.
And that within the DNA, there's something called alleles, correct?
Those are, yes, the specific types of the DNA profile.
And they're, for those of us who remember this from maybe high school biology, the DNA is kind of a double helix. It's sort of a twisty thing. That's how it's described. I think that's, if you use an electron microscope, that's how it'll appear, right?
It's like a twisted ladder or spiral staircase, yes.
And within that twisted ladder or spiral staircase, there are the alleles repeat at certain intervals, correct?
Correct.
And in any event, you're going to inherit half of your alleles from the male side, the dad, and half the alleles from the mom side, right?
Correct.
So one of the ways that these ancestry organizations work is they can trace your ancestry based on maybe a cheek swab or something, looking at other people in the database to see whether you're related to somebody else, right?
Correct, yes.
Because there'll be a lot of similarities between you and your parents and your children, right?
There could be, yes.
And in any event, if there are twins, whether they're identical or they're fraternal twins, they're at least close in, there'll be a lot of similar DNA, right?
There could be, yes.
So when you're running this program, the STR Mix program, right? This is a proprietary program, right?
We do not know the source code. We know how it works, but we do not know the source code.
Right, in other words, it's a private company that has patented this calculation simulation, right?
It's a private company, yes.
So you're programming in information, right?
I put in the DNA profile.
And other information too, right?
Yes, I tell it how many number of contributors I believe it is.
Right, and I want to ask you about that. You put in a number of contributors that you believe or assume are in a mixture of DNA, right?
Based on my knowledge, training, experience looking at profiles, yes, I give my best estimate of how many contributors I believe that DNA profile is from the data.
And of course, that makes it more difficult when there's multiple contributors, right?
Sometimes it can, yes.
And in addition to that, if you have a very tiny sample that's only partial DNA, it's even more complicated, isn't it?
It can be, yes.
And some of the things when you talked about it, you said that it was inconclusive. Part of the reason was the sample wasn't even big enough to get enough alleles and repetition within a sample. Isn't that true?
Well, I'd have to know exactly what sample we're talking about.
Well, I'm using just in general. We went through a lot. Some of them, it was inconclusive because it was too small a sample for you to be able to derive a profile from it,
I
right?
think, yeah, I call those insufficient, I believe, when it's too small of an amount to make a comparison.
Okay, well, you're using the word insufficient, whether it's little or insufficient, it's just not enough sample for you to develop a profile of a person, right?
You're talking about two different conclusions, yes.
All right, well,
Yeah.
fine, all right. Now, when it comes to what the lab does, you're not actually comparing the whole DNA to another person, are you?
I don't understand your question.
You're only choosing alleles from certain pinpointed locations along the double helix, right?
Well, 99% of everybody's DNA is the same, and we focus on this 1% that is most variable between individuals. And we use a kit that has a certain amount of sites that we do test. Yeah, so it's not every single site, but it's a representation of some of the
Right,
alleles that vary.
And currently, the system you use has, I believe, what, 21?
Autosomals for statistics, global filer, yes. but
Right,
it also
global
has-
filer, you take 21 points along the DNA strand to make a comparison, right?
21 autosomal sites, yeah, locus.
No, it's not a genome of that person or anybody, right?
It's not their whole genome, no.
Okay, and just for clarification, how many loci are there in a human DNA?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that.
Is it in the hundreds?
Just going to object, Your Honor. She indicated she doesn't know the answer.
Well, the question really is, what is the range or an estimate generally? So overruled.
Give us an estimate.
I honestly really don't know if it's hundreds or thousands.
What was that number?
I honestly don't know if it's hundreds or thousands for how many loci.
It may be hundreds of thousands, right?
It could be, I honestly really do not know.
But we're only focusing on either 21 or maybe 23 locations along the strand, right?
Very discriminating locations, yes.
And when you're looking at alleles, right, you're not just looking at what the specific allele is called, because they'll have numbers and letters, right?
Numbers,
But how often it repeats along a DNA strand, right?
right, that number is how many times it's repeated.
And that's how you determine whether it's unique to a particular person or you can compare it to another person, right?
That's how I just determine the DNA profile, is by the number of repeats at each testing site.
And some of the alleles occur in a large percentage of the I'm using the word loci because loci basically means places, right, or pinpoints, right?
Those are the different sites that we're testing,
Right,
yes.
but I'm using the word loci so that the jury understands that that word is a Latin term for location, basically. It's another way of saying that, right? Yes?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So certain of the loci, for example, are only found in male DNA, right?
Yes, there are sites that we test that are only found on the Y chromosome.
And are there some that are only found in the X chromosome?
That would be mitochondrial DNA.
Okay. And you, according to your resume, had some experience in doing mitochondrial DNA testing, right?
I do, yes.
But we're not talking about that here, are we?
No.
some of the DNA repeats, they're given actual numbers, either whole numbers or decimal partial numbers, right?
Correct.
And that's how you determine how often it's going to repeat on the DNA, correct?
In that specific location, that's how many times that length variation repeats, yes.
And if you look at one of your reports, there's a chart that's contained in many of them, right?
Correct, we used to produce an allele table with everybody's types on it.
And if it shows the numbers, those are any numbers you put on there showing how often something repeats in your sample, right?
At that, yes.
We're also looking at a unknown sample, the one that came from a swab or on a piece of material or whatever else that you are taking to determine whether or not that DNA shows similar repetitions as one of the people you're testing against, right?
I am comparing the DNA types from a known profile to the DNA types of an evidentiary profile, yes.
And when you use the word during your direct examination a lot, assuming X or Y, or assuming this or that, you made certain assumptions as to many of these samples before you then compared it to something else, right?
Correct, I determine the number of contributors in the evidentiary profiles before I compare them.
But you also, for some of them, assumed, let's say, that the person whose DNA was on the toothbrush, right, was one of the contributors to the sample, right?
In certain non-probative pieces of evidence, yes, we do that.
Well, you're using words like non-probative. You made the determination to use that regardless of whether you think it's probative or not, right?
No, we only can use we only can condition a known profile on an item if it's a non-probative comparison, typically a victim, that you would expect scientific expectation that the profile should be there. So like if my car gets stolen and it's recovered and they swab the steering wheel, you would expect my DNA profile to be on the steering wheel with anybody else who may have drove it. So if we would condition my DNA profile if it was truly there. If I looked at the results and saw my types there, I would condition my known in order to get the second contributor better explained.
So you were assuming, I assume by that answer, you were assuming that your DNA would be on your steering wheel, is what you're
If
saying.
looking at the data, it was there, yes. But looking at the data, I have to see my types there. I wouldn't just say I'm there. I would look at the data and see that my types are there.
But if you assumed that the contributor was someone else, whether it was a close family relative or not, it would change the likelihood ratios, wouldn't it?
Well, we would have to have a
That's a
scientific
yes or no,
expectation.
wouldn't it?
Well, to indicate to an expert what the expert's answer is, when an expert is qualified by education, knowledge, training, experience, and skill, is inappropriate. Secondly, the witness took an oath to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth. To tell the witness what the answer should be is inappropriate. You can move it to have it stricken as non-responsive, but this court does not permit counsel to tell a witness what their testimony should be.
Yes, Your Honor. Let me
You can ask
rephrase-
the question again.
Right. Let me rephrase the question. Right? Regardless of whether I use the example of your steering wheel or not use any example whatsoever, the assumptions that you made about a contributor would, if you changed that assumption to a different known contributor, it would alter the likelihood ratio that would come out of the STR mixed computer program, correct?
Again, it's hard to answer as a yes or no.
So it wouldn't change it? It would come out the same?
No, it could, but it all depends on the data and if that person is scientifically expected to, be on that profile, and their profile is there.
But once you run the program and you come up with a deconvolution report on using STR mix, when you then test it against someone else, you don't go back and pretend you don't know who the source is. You start with what you've already, we'll call it deconvoluted, right?
You have one original deconvolution, yes.
Right. So when you add someone, you're starting with the likelihood ratios that the computer has spit out for you previously, right?
You don't get the likelihood ratios until you make a comparison to an individual.
But you don't do a full deconvolution analysis again over the same sample if you're running it against other people. Is that a fair statement?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah. If you decide to check the sample, an unknown, against other people, you start with the report that was already developed from the STR mix computer printout previously, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Let me just ask you some questions about some of the other things that came up on direct examination. A lot of the descriptions, both in the stipulation that we've entered into, the lawyers have entered into, and in your report, make reference to descriptions such as swabs from a blood stain, luminol plus whatever, KM plus. These are things that you mentioned. Those were how it came to you with a title, right?
Yes, that was how the submitting agency named that piece of evidence.
So you didn't label that this had was a blood-like stain, did you?
I did not, no.
The police called it that, right?
Yeah, whoever the submitting agency was, yes.
Same thing with if they said Kastle-Meyer KM plus, that's just the police writing that down on the sample that they put on the bag that they then submit to the lab, right?
Correct, yes.
Same thing with if they use luminol, that is just something they wrote on the bag,
I'm
right?
just going to object, Your Honor, at this point.
Grounds.
May we have a brief sidebar?
Well, first, the nature of the questions are simply as the court understands them. This witness did not write the descriptions on the bags. And this witness has stated she did not write the descriptions on the bags. So the court does not really see, unless there's a relevance objection, the necessity for a sidebar.
Well, may I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm objecting because I think it mischaracterizes what happened. I think the question sort of assumes that the police are just writing these things as though no test was done, and I don't think that that's what the evidence is.
Well, that's essentially, in the court's view, an extraction from the questions. The questions appear to be very simple. There was information on the bag when you first saw them. That's how the court hears the question. So what is flowing from that, the court cannot contemplate, other than the fact that there was information on the bag and she did not write it. Overruled.
Am I correct? It was just something that was written on the description that you then note. You didn't change the description that the police put on it, correct?
No, we used what the police describe it as, so it continues through.
Right. You just give it your own letters and numbers to distinguish what you do from the exhibit and description that the police put on the bag, right?
Yes, we have unique item numbers for our pieces of evidence under our case number.
Right. And I just want to be clear, you indicated that you're familiar with a little bit with Kastle-Meyer KM, is that right?
I am, yes.
But you're not a biologist, right?
I'm a forensic scientist who I've had training on KM. I have a proficiency test twice a year in order to perform KM, so I can perform KM testing and have been
just-
trained.
I didn't want to interrupt. Did you finish your answer?
Yeah. Mhm.
And KM is not used, it's one of these presumptive tests, right?
We call it a screening test.
A screening test. It does not mean that a substance is blood, does it?
No, it just is testing to see if there could be the presence of blood.
There could be, but you're familiar with the fact that many other things test positive if you use a KM on it, right?
Yes, other things can make a positive result.
And we're not just talking about animal blood, are we?
No, there's other plants and horseradish. There's a couple things that will make the test turn positive, but we're trained to swab things that are reddish brown in color and not just any swab.
But you made no determination as to whether or not any of these items yourself, you didn't determine whether they contain blood or not, did you?
I do believe that there are some items in here that we did do KM testing on at the lab. That would have been Christine Roy, but I have some of those results in my lab, in my reports.
No, I'm saying you personally did not.
No, me personally, no, all these evidence items went to forensic biology first, and they did all the testing.
And you know that you would not rely on a KM test to make a determination as to whether something actually was blood or not, would you?
No, KM testing cannot tell you that it's 100% blood.
Well, it can't even tell you if it's 99% blood, can it?
No.
Potatoes are one of those things that test positive, right?
I don't know definitely that. I know horseradish and some, we were trained to know that horseradish and some plant peroxidases do, but I mean.
And rust can too, right?
Rust is kind of tricky. Sometimes so when you do KM testing, you add that first colorless liquid, and rust makes it change pink then, versus you're not supposed to change pink until after you add the second solution. So rust is kind of like a false positive.
But anyway, rust, from your own personal knowledge, is kind of a reddish brown color too, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And you wouldn't say that it's scientifically reliable, that is, any reagent presumptive test is not reliable for finding blood, is it?
I would say that a screening test is reliable for saying that it's KM positive and there's a chance that blood would be there, but we can't say that it was blood, no.
You're saying there's a chance that there is. My question is, you wouldn't testify that as a result of a KM test, that something was in fact human blood, would you?
I would not, no.
You're also aware that most of the items that you went through, that you tested for, were not even screened for whether there was actually blood or not through the biology portion of your labs. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, the ones that come in that are already labeled KM positive or luminol positive or even negative, we don't repeat that test because we do the same tests and we trust that the PD did their correct testing and we wouldn't waste samples from the swabs to do that test again and take some of that sample that would then maybe not lead to a full DNA profile.
Ms. Madel, you're not in the biology department that does the testing for blood, are you?
I do know the protocols, though.
All right, but you're not in that department, right?
Forensic biology and DNA kind of are intertwined, and I'm trained on some evidence exam, and I'm competent on KM, so you know, I'm not, but I'm majorly a part of the DNA unit.
And I just want to be clear, you would not testify under oath that something was in fact blood based solely on the fact there was a positive KM test, would you?
No, I would not.
And when I asked you, most of the samples that we went through earlier through the state, you went through 100 maybe samples. I asked you whether or not most of them were not tested at the lab, and I don't think you answered that question. Am I correct that most of them were not tested with a confirmatory test for what it was, correct?
None of them were tested in these samples as confirmatory.
Earlier, when you were asked what are the sources of DNA, you made reference to blood. Let me just look at my notes here. You said blood, semen, I think you said hair, and you said bones, right? Didn't you leave out like the major source of DNA in that answer?
Blood, semen, saliva, bones, teeth, hair?
How about skin?
Cells, skin cells.
Skin cells, okay. Let's talk about skin cells. All of us have skin cells, right?
Yes,
And all of us have the same DNA in our skin cells that we do in our hair, in our blood, in our, shall we just say, our bodily fluids, right?
correct, yes.
So you could take a cheek sample, swab, right? And you would run a DNA profile on that cheek swab. You follow me so far, right?
Yes.
And it would be the same result for the DNA profile as if I took a sample of blood, right?
From the same person, yes.
Well, that's what I meant,
Yeah.
from the same person. Okay. And when it comes to skin cells, for most people, they're shedding skin cells all the time, aren't they?
Yes,
And in fact, if you cough or sneeze, you're also through what they call aerosoliation, right? You're expelling DNA that way too, aren't you?
yes, that's possible, yes.
When it comes to DNA, there's also something called primary transfer and secondary transfer. Is that correct?
Yes,
And I'm not sure you explained the distinction between those, but if we're talking about touch DNA, right, when you get a sample, does the biology forensic portion of your lab note on the file jacket whether something is touch DNA or some kind of fluid DNA?
they do.
And when you gave your testimony today, you did not distinguish between whether any of the samples that you tested and re-identified with the letters and numbers that we went through, whether they were touch DNA or something else, right?
Correct, I do not. I just test the evidence that they submit forward to me.
However it comes to you, you do a DNA profile and then you run the test on that regardless of what the source is, right?
Yes,
And when there's a mixture, as you pointed out, of more than one source in a DNA, one might be from a liquid source and one might be touch DNA at the same time, right?
that is possible, yes. We can't distinguish where the DNA came from.
And if, for example, if I were to sneeze into my hand, as some people hopefully don't do, and then touch a doorknob, chances are that there might be a mixture of just me of both the skin DNA and maybe a liquid DNA on that doorknob, right?
That's possible, yes.
And then if someone else goes and touches that doorknob, they're not only gonna maybe have a disgusting mess on their hand, maybe get some cold germs, but they're gonna maybe get some of that transfer of the other person's DNA onto them. Is that right?
That's possible, yes.
All right. And then if I were to come over, or I don't want to use me, if that person was then to go over and shake someone else's hand, that's what secondary transfer is. If now my DNA or the first person's DNA is now on that hand of that second person, right?
That's possible, yes.
And that's regardless of whether someone's wearing gloves or not, right?
No, it can pick, if they touch a doorknob with gloves on and then touch something else with the gloves on, the DNA would be on the gloves.
The DNA could then transfer to that other person as well.
Correct, yes.
And to other surfaces that they then touch, right?
That is possible, yes.
And when you talk about, there were a couple of examples you gave where there are maybe 4 or even 5 contributors to a sample, right?
Sometimes we have 4 or 5, yes.
And it gets more complicated, more convoluted, if you will, to try and separate it out the more contributors you have, right?
And that's why we use Star Mix, yes.
Exactly, right? And then you're relying on Star Mix because it's just running this program to give you likelihoods of hypothesis A versus hypothesis B, right?
No, it's actually, Star Mix is giving us weights to best explain the different components that actually make up that mixture profile. That's what Star Mix is doing.
But what I'm trying to understand is it's not making a match to anybody, is it?
No, it's deconvoluting that mixture of 4 people to try and determine the best explanation of the 4 different people that are contributing to that 4-person.
But in any event, the word is a likelihood, not an actual, it's not identifying anyone, is it?
No, it doesn't identify anybody.
And when a report is inconclusive, I think you indicated, and you said it a few times, one of the ways that it's inconclusive is the sample is either too small for there to be enough allele locations to be able to be clear on who that person, who it might be connected with, correct?
I believe that's my insufficient conclusion, insufficient for comparison.
And inconclusive means either there's too many people that maybe have similar DNA, or it's just not enough points of reference to make a determination, right?
The inconclusive is when we do that likelihood ratio, and the likelihood ratio comes out to be in this range that is below a positive association, but above being eliminated. So
Right.
that's why we can't make a conclusion.
Right, and the danger, of course, with inconclusive is there could be false positives, and you could make mistakes if you try to subscribe an inconclusive result to anyone in particular, right?
Well, we just have that range that we say is inconclusive because it's not above what we deem positive.
Well, when you say it's a scientific level that's been established by the lab, right?
That it's not a positive association, correct?
And when you say someone is excluded, it's because there is an allele present that you know from the profile of the actual person is missing, or is missing completely, right?
Well, it's not just one allele, it's the profile overall.
Oh, I meant to say that if you count all of the alleles that you produce, even if it's more than one person, that the individual you're comparing it against is actually, does not have that allele at all, right? That's how you eliminate somebody.
Not just from one allele, you have to look at the profile overall, the data, the number of contributors, the peak height, so it's a little bit more complicated than just not having one allele.
So other than in a couple of situations where there was inconclusive information, and I think you mentioned that every one of the people you mentioned had at least one inconclusive, right? Whether they were a contributor or not, right? All the children.
Were at least inconclusive once overall.
I'm trying to make a broad question. You went
Okay.
through 100, I could pull out the individual ones, but I'm
Okay.
just trying.
Yes,
There
the
were
children
some
were
where all the children were at least, on one occasion, inconclusive, right?
Yes,
And in others, they were actually contributors.
yes,
And then there's others where they were eliminated.
yes,
And then there was a fourth category you said, where I think you said it cannot be eliminated, right?
yes,
That was because it was a higher threshold than inconclusive, but less than identified as a contributor, right?
So the cannot be eliminated is a positive association that, it was just a terminology that we used to use, and we've currently changed the way we report that as consistent with the contributor, which I defined also, because it was confusing to people for us to say cannot be eliminated, because we were saying eliminated, but it was actually the opposite, you cannot be eliminated. So it's still a positive association, it's just the wording was a little
Yeah,
different.
but I want to be clear, when you say a positive association, it's below a threshold where you could testify that that person's DNA was actually present, correct?
No, it was a positive association. They were our match. They were a partial match, but they were our match and had a positive association.
When you say partial, you're again talking about that you could not testify that it was a match because it was only a partial identification or partial connection, right?
It was a partial match, but it had a positive likelihood ratio.
Again, that's the computer saying it's a likelihood ratio, right? Positive likelihood.
Well, we used star mix to calculate that because it would take us too long to do all those hand calculations.
And I take it you've never tried to mimic a STR mix report by hand calculating out the odds, have you?
In my training, I only had to do it once,
All right.
correct? I have not done it a million times, no.
A million times. And the machine runs odds a million times, doesn't it?
It has many iterations to try and describe the components of the profile, and then it calculates the likelihood ratio.
All right. Let me ask you a different question. Let me put it to a different way. The program runs what's known as an algorithm, right?
Correct.
That's the proprietary source code for STR mix, right?
Within the mathematical process, yes.
And you don't know, you could not describe how that process actually, you don't know the code is what I'm trying to get at here for
I
that.
do not know the code of the algorithm, no, I do not.
But these kind of programs that run these kind of likelihood of a certain result are similar to what's used by the lottery for calculating the odds of winning the Powerball, right?
I honestly do not know what kind of calculation they use for that.
Are you familiar with the term the Markov chain Monte Carlo?
Yes, that's the mathematical process used in Star Mix, yes.
Okay. Do you know why the word Monte Carlo is part of the name there?
Right, because it was originating from a gambling, yes. But I didn't know that that was used for the lottery.
All right. But, all right, so the gambling though, right?
Yep.
You're talking about Monte Carlo as the capital in Monaco in Europe, which is a big gambling mecca, right?
Yes,
And what they're doing is that kind of program calculates the odds of winning the jackpot on whatever machine, gambling machine, is being run with a giant jackpot, right? You don't know?
I guess, I don't know that.
All right. But if, using that as an example though, if two people, if the odds of winning the billion-dollar Powerball, according to a program, an algorithm such as this, were 1 in 100 billion, right? Just assume for my hypothetical here. Does that mean if two people were to win it, that they were cheating?
That's different odds. You're saying 1 in 100 billion, where we're having the likelihood ratio with two competing hypotheses. So given my likelihood ratio is different than
Right.
that.
And again, we're talking about hypotheses. Again, you're basing the hypothesis based on a prosecution's theory of a case, right?
No, we base it on the background information of a case and the actual profile itself.
Well, who decides on the hypothesis? You
I
or
do,
someone else?
yes.
You make the
The
determination of the
DNA analyst,
hypothesis.
yes.
And you have to read something about a case just to make that hypothesis, right?
You need background information on what the kind of case is, yes, and the pieces of evidence, yes.
Because otherwise, it's not like you're blindly taking a piece of evidence, putting it into a machine, and then coming up with a result without you having subjective input, right?
Correct.
Okay. And just so that I'm clear, I'm going to go back to the issue of, you already testified that what the STR mix is doing is not matching a sample to a particular person or two people or three. It's giving a likelihood of a ratio based on two hypotheses, right?
And how likely that evidence is to occur given hypothesis 1 compared to hypothesis 2.
And when you say likelihood, we're talking about odds, aren't we? Mathematical odds, correct?
Yes.
And let me ask that. So these odds are not based on population numbers either, are they?
No, it's not a frequency estimate, no.
So when we hear large numbers like 10 billion or 4 billion or 150 or 250,000 or 100 billion, we're not talking about other people on Earth, are we?
No, we're not.
Those numbers have nothing to do with populations, correct?
Correct.
And when we talk about skin cell DNA, you referred to that as touch DNA, right?
So the forensic community is trying not to refer to some low-level DNA that might be collected from a surface as touch anymore, because we don't want to imply that someone actually did touch this counter and left their DNA. So we're calling it more trace DNA when it's small amounts recovered from an object or surface.
You are aware, though, that even at least at the time of 2019, the folder, some of the forensic folders from your lab still are using terms like touch in relation to this very case, right?
Well, yes, I mean, that's kind of also just for them to distinguish between when they have a piece of clothing that has bloody areas and then has non-bloody areas. They're just making that notation to say, like, I'm trying to avoid swabbing where the blood is, so this is an area that didn't appear to have a reddish-brown stain, so I swabbed it, the touch area where something might have been touched versus having a body fluid on it.
And if somebody, for example, if I stay away from the word touch and instead use the term skin cells, that would be a better way to describe it, right?
Describe,
The word touch DNA.
yes, I mean, touch DNA, yes. If you're saying someone touched something, you would get skin cells there, yes.
But if, let's say, I don't know, a police officer is walking through a house touching things, chances are that person's DNA might be found on those areas that were touched, right?
It could be, yes.
And if you have a result where you have unknown contributors to the DNA, it could be anybody who walked through that door who isn't separately tested to see if it belongs to them, right?
That's possible, yes.
Who told you to limit your DNA comparison to the children, to Lauren Almeida, to Fotis Dulos and Michelle Troconis, and Pavel Gumieni?
I only can make comparisons to the knowns that are submitted from the agencies, so that's what I do. When I get a known that's submitted by an agency, it gets processed, and that's who I make the comparisons to. I don't ask for additional knowns unless it's for an elimination known, like the situation for a stolen car. We get a swab of a steering wheel, it's a two-person mixture. I don't know if that person who owns the car is on there too, so I would ask for their known. But otherwise, I wouldn't ask for particular knowns unless there was a,
And I don't think you were asked this by the state, so I just want to ask you this. When a swab is submitted to you, it's from some surface has been wiped. Let's set aside for a moment if an actual object or cloth, as you said, item of clothing or something is submitted. We're just talking about a swab.
okay.
You have not observed how well or how poorly that swab has been administered, correct?
Yeah, if I did not make the cutting of the swab, I did not see it, therefore I don't know, yeah, what the swab looked like.
Do you get the actual cutting, or do you get the chemical or liquid that cutting of the swab was put into?
No, I get the actual swab in a tube.
But you get a snip off of, it's like a giant cotton tip applicator, right? So those of us who have had COVID testing know it's like these long sticks with a cotton tip at the end, right?
Correct, yes.
Bigger than a Q-tip that you might find in a hotel bathroom here, right?
So yeah, the forensic biologist would cut that swab, that cotton part off and put it into a tube.
Put in a tube, then it's given to you.
Correct.
And then you do something where you copy that sample, is that right?
Well, first, yeah, we extract it first, get the extract, then we see how much DNA we have, and then we make all those many copies so we can hopefully generate a DNA profile.
And at least as of 2019, when most of this, 2019 and 2020, when most of these comparisons were done, you were able to extract some DNA from as little as 3 cells, right?
I'd have to go back and look at my quant values for all this thing to testify that I did have something that was that small amount.
Is that are any of the reports up there for you to do that?
No.
Well, you used at the time, is it Fusion 6C?
Fusion 60 was the STR kit for 2019 and 20, yes.
And you would take a sample, these are tiny, tiny amounts, right?
There could be tiny, tiny amounts of DNA, yes.
And so the jury has some kind of semblance of size. One cell, as I understand it, is 6.6 picograms in, is that weight or size?
Weight,
Weight.
yes.
And so that we're clear, you've got grams, you have milligrams, you have nanograms, and you go down to picograms, right?
Correct.
And 1 picogram is a trillionth of a gram, right?
1 picogram. Yes,
You should
I
know
believe-
this
I
is
believe so,
math, right?
yes.
You should know
Yep.
that, right? Am I right?
Yes,
Okay. So if you have one cell is 6.6 picograms, we're talking about 6.6 trillionths of a gram, right?
yep,
And if you're not disagreeing that you can get a sample out of it, as little as 3 cells.
So 3 cells would be 18 picograms, approximately.
Well,
6.6
0.6,
times
so
3, yes.
more like 20.
So
right?
20 picograms.
Okay.
You might get a few peaks. We target for fusion, we were targeting 500 picograms. To
That's
get a,
your goal.
To get a full, correct, yes.
But if you don't have that, you run the test anyway, right?
Correct, yes.
And that's how you get these partial results. Isn't that true?
That is true, yes.
And that's why in a lot of the places along the loci, it'll show NR, meaning no result.
No result is NR, yes.
So you then have just a partial DNA, and the machine is still trying to run the ratio, the likelihood ratio against a partial DNA result, isn't it?
We could try and run a likelihood ratio of a partial, yes.
And doesn't STR mix actually add in, like presume, what if there was this extra allele in there? Isn't that part of its whole process?
The whole process is trying to explain what makes up that profile, yes, by how the PCR program works, which is the amplification process. It knows how it works. It is trying to use those, the word I'm looking for, use the way PCR works in order to come up with the best explanation for that profile, whether it be a full profile or a partial profile. It produces these individual components with weights to them.
So this isn't like AI though, right? It's not artificial intelligence, but it's something like that, right?
No, we know how it works. We know the mathematical process that's being used, the MCMC as you referred to, and the biological modeling of the PCR reaction. And it's doing all these iterations to best describe that DNA profile.
I understand, but getting back to what I was trying to say is, it is filling in. It says, what if the missing allele was X or 7 or 12, whatever, and then runs the program again to see if it was that, how would it come out in the likelihood? Isn't that part of the process?
Not to do with the likelihood ratio. It's doing all those weights first.
But it also assumes missing data, and it adds it in as a part of its probability, isn't it?
It's giving weights to possible explanations. So it does
Including-
look at other things, but it's like a game of hot and cold. It's proposing this type to make up the profile, and if it is a hot or a good explanation, it goes towards that iteration. If it's not a good, it'll be a cold, and it will go in a different direction to try and best explain the different DNA types that are making up that profile. And then those weights are used then, after it comes to a conclusion on what is the best explanation, then it uses those weights to calculate that likelihood ratio.
And so you're accepting the calculations from the program for your conclusions that you've told us about today, right?
Yes.
All right. When it comes to this sample, we talked about how little it could be, and just for reference, would a period on a daily newspaper be larger than the 20 picograms that we're talking about in terms of just being able to visualize it?
You can't visualize 20 picograms.
It's
No.
way microscopic, right?
Correct.
And the only way that you're able to even run this process is you do some kind of the equivalent of like photocopying the sample you have, right?
Correct.
So you have a process that's, I'm not challenging, it's just established. So you sort of mimeograph for those of us who are a little bit older, or you photocopy the data so you have enough to then run through your program, right?
We have enough so that we hopefully can develop a DNA profile.
Now, there's also a major and minor contributor to various samples if there's more than one contributor to a sample. Isn't that true?
Sometimes that can be determined, yes.
Who decides what those percentages of major and minor contributors is going to be?
Well, we can look at it as a DNA analyst and estimate, but when we run through star mix, it also gives a weight to what each contributor is contributing to that profile.
And again, this is calculating based on the quantity of what is now in the system based on your multiplication or photocopying of it into making it a larger sample, right?
Based on, yes, the number of contributors I'm calling it, and then the DNA profile result that we obtained, yes.
And when we're talking about major and minor contributors, if it's I don't know, 60 or 70%, and the others are, and the other contributors are 20 and 30%. The person, let me rephrase that, the sample with the higher percentage is considered the major contributor, right?
That would be yes.
And that all the lower numbers are the minor contributors, right?
Yes, but sometimes you can't determine a major contributor and a minor contributor.
Well, when you say you can, but can STR mix?
Well, STR mix doesn't ever call anything a major and a minor. It just gives you those percentages to make it to 100.
Do you ever disagree with its percentages? Are you able to recalculate that, saying this is wrong?
We do, that's one of the parameters that we do check to make sure star mix runs correctly.
So Attorney Schoenhorn, if the next series of questions do not concern major and minor contributors, it's 3 o'clock.
That's correct. So I think this would be a good place to stop for the day.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we conclude the evidence for today. We suggest again that you would check the judicial branch website tomorrow because the weather may be such that there may be a delayed opening. And we would ask that you please do not discuss the case and have a good evening.
Could we, well, off the record, just.
You may be excused.
Okay.
Thank you. Cross-examination is expected to continue tomorrow for this witness, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and how long do you estimate on cross, Attorney Schoenhorn?
15, 20 minutes?
Okay, thank you. And the state has a lineup for tomorrow? Okay, thank you. We'll stand adjourned until tomorrow morning, right now at 10 o'clock.
Could we start at 10:15 with the court's permission?
We can. So adjourned until tomorrow morning, 10:15.
Thank you.
All right.